So hi everyone. When we were doing coverage for the general election back in July, Theo and I put up a clip of a young man, his name is Liam McLaughlan, and he was standing as a member of the Scottish Socialist Party in Glasgow East. We've contacted him recently because we knew that he was one of the speakers at an event organised by a group called Conter. We've had a look at the speech that he gave. We both think it's a bit of a cracker of one. And we also had him into the studio here with us and had a chat with him.
So the Conter conference was timed for the 10th anniversary since the independence referendum, wasn't it? And you gave the opening speech. So tell us a bit more about the conference.
The first thing that struck me was that it's probably the first time that many of us have been in the same room for quite a long time. And that in itself, I suppose, probably speaks to slightly why we're maybe in some of the difficulties that we're facing just now, I suppose. And I know that the organisers of that event, the purpose of it was to try and provoke discussion and debate. So there was a difference of opinion on several things within the room. The kind of feeling was that was specifically what the event was designed to do. It was to bring people with slightly different perspectives and views on where we are now, how we got here, and where we move forward, to bring us into the same room and to have that discussion and debate between us. That, for me, was the kind of best thing about the Yes campaign 10 years ago. I think, sadly, we have lost a bit of that over the last 10 years, is that we've lost that. The greatest strength we had in many ways was the diversity of organisation, but unity and purpose. And in many ways, I think we've perhaps lost that over the last 10 years. So the event itself was fairly well attended. And as I say, looking about the room, there were some faces I recognised and some others that I didn't recognise. So perhaps there's a layer of independence activists who perhaps might not actually have been involved in 2014, but are starting to attend events like that one on Saturday, and there may well have been some of those at the event that you were at as well, Marlene, in the square as well, because it is 10 years since 2014. It's hard to believe, as I say. So, I thought the event, for what I've seen, did exactly what it was billed to do, and there was a difference of opinion, and that was welcomed. And I've always felt comfortable in the knowledge that when you're part of a movement the size of the Yes movement, that you won't agree with everybody on everything, but you should be able to still be involved in that campaign and share a space where you can have discussion and debate and discuss kind of how we move forward together. And that was the main kind of focus of my remarks. I kind of split it into three sections, which was where are we now, politically speaking, both in Britain and specifically in Scotland. How did we get here? We'll focus on the last sort of 9 years, and then where do we go forward? Because I always think it's good to provide that analysis and perspective about what's happened since, but you do need to be able to point people in some kind of a direction as to where we move forward.
We both thought your speech was really, really good, and we're going to play it in full right now. So this is Liam delivering the opening speech at the Conter conference in Glasgow on the 14th of September.
I first got involved in politics back in 2012, at that time as a 16-year-old. And the very first thing I did was going around local fun days, it was at the time. And some of you might remember this. It was the Yes Scotland Independence Declaration that you were asking people to sign, something that in my youthful enthusiasm I thought was making a real difference. And 10 years later I now realise it was probably just a data mining exercise for the SNP. As Jonathan was saying there, during the course of the referendum and towards the latter stages of it, I was involved both in the Radical Independence campaign as the joint organiser of the Glasgow North and East branch of the campaign, and I was also taking my first steps into party politics as a member of the SSP. And two things during the referendum that for me stay is probably the most proud thing that I am in terms of my contribution to the movement and to politics over the last 10 years. And the first of which was the voter registration drive that we undertook in the summer of 2014 before the deadline, where we had working class communities outside shopping centres and job centres, targeting specifically and deliberately people who had been totally disenfranchised by the political process, popping up street stalls in various different locations across the city, and we had queues of people queuing up to register to vote in areas that, as I say, had been totally disenfranchised. And the second thing that I'm most proud of in my role in that campaign was the birth of the mass canvasses. In many ways, actually, probably two sides of the same coin in regards to the voter registration drive, where we deliberately and again strategically got as many folk together as we could on the left of the independence movement, and specifically targeted the very same working class communities that we'd spent time in the summer asking people to register to vote. And the then shadow Scottish Secretary, who unfortunately at that time was my MP, labelled me and by proxy the campaign as both a danger and a threat. And 10 years on, as you can imagine, that's still two quotes that I wear as a sort of badge of honour, even 10 years on. But that's probably enough for me about 2014, and I should probably say now that I'm going to do two things that perhaps people don't do very often when they're speaking to a crowd like this. The first is to say that if you're here for a backslapping, nostalgic exercise looking back on the virtues of 2014, then you're probably in the wrong room and you should leave now. And that some of the remarks that I make during the course of my introduction you probably might disagree with, and frankly I hope that you do, because for me that's the whole purpose and the point of us being here today. So I'm going to centre my remarks in opening the discussion around three questions that I think should be at the forefront of all our minds. And 10 years on, I'm still, I see from the introduction, I'm still clinging on to that youth campaigner at the age of 28. I'm also a proud trade unionist, and my trade union unison describes anybody as a young member as somebody who's under 30, so using that metric I've still got 18 months to go, and I'm going to milk that for every day it's worth. So the first question that I think that we should collectively discuss is, where are we now? And in a UK perspective, after 14 years a rotten Tory government, we've finally managed to replace them and boot them out. A government that was characterised by cuts, chaos, corruption and COVID, led by characters who could also be described by a number of adjectives beginning with C, but since this has been recorded, I'll let you fill in the blanks. You would be forgiven for thinking that 2 months down the line that getting rid of such a rotten, insipid government, that the country at large and political activists like us would be somewhat inspired and motivated by the situation that we find ourselves in. But what have we actually replaced that Tory government with? By the looks of things, it's the most right-wing of Labour governments, as uninspiring as it is contemptuous, frankly. And far be it from me to hold up New Labour as any sort of bastion of social progress, but can you imagine even this Starmer government having even the political ability to bring about anything like the national minimum wage or an anti-poverty measure like tax credits, or having the competence, frankly, to deliver something like devolution or to deliver a peace deal in the north of the island? By contrast, the Starmer government's first two major policy associations are the retention of the two-child benefit cap and the means testing of the winter fuel allowance, deliberately and consciously impoverishing young people at one end and quite literally enacting a policy that, by their own analysis just 6 months ago, when the Tories were in power and considering this measure, will kill pensioners during the course of this winter. So faced with that, is it any wonder why people are quite frankly fed up with the whole political system and everybody involved in it? That's not to touch on, of course, just last Sunday, the publication of an NHS review that's been spearheaded by the private sector, the aggressive drive and rhetoric led by the Shadow Home Secretary to drive out very, very vulnerable people who've came here seeking asylum. And these are perfect conditions in which for the far right to operate in. When these people who are representing the Labour Party just now are portrayed as somehow reflective of the left, I can understand perfectly well why people are seduced by the likes of Farage and Tommy Robinson. It's an easy expression of their anger and disappointment in the whole political system. And frankly, I think until we all accept and begin to understand why people in working class communities are seduced by the likes of Farage and Robinson, then we have no chance of even attempting to win them back, which should be the objective of everybody in this room. George Square last Saturday, and I was there, That was the easy part. What did you do last Sunday? What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do tomorrow? Who are you going to speak to next week? Because it's only by having conversations on a daily basis in working class communities and workplaces and colleges and universities. That's how you defeat the far right. Last Saturday was a good show of strength, but that's all it was. The real work's actually taking place in communities, workplaces, colleges and universities on a daily basis. And in the Scottish context, we've now got an independence campaign, if you can call it that, which is a bit lost at sea. It looks to me to be directionless, devoid of strategy on the how we get to an independent Scotland, and without a credible programme to deliver on the why. A campaign that looks to me to still be reeling from the Supreme Court fiasco, and I don't use that word lightly, because I think that's what it was. And then, of course, who can forget the de facto referendum mess that was planned in the aftermath of. And as I was standing in the stage in Glasgow City Council, in the Emirates at the Glasgow City Council count, alongside some others in the room who I can see here as well, watching Labour MP after Labour MP be elected, not just in this city, but right across the Central Belt, I paused and pondered for a second and thought back to 2015, when I stood there in the exact same stage watching SNP MP after SNP MP be elected right across this city and right across the Central Belt. And I thought, what a monumental waste of momentum and opportunity that has been squandered over the last 9 years. 9 years, less than a decade. If you'd have told me and anybody else there who was present at that count in 2015 that less than a decade later you would be watching the exact same in reverse, I don't think anybody would have believed it. And in the policy front at home, to be honest, I didn't really know where to start. But I think a starting point should be the £500 million cuts budget that's just been announced this week, and a programme for government notable only for the absence of anything pretty much new or exciting. And I think everybody in this room should be under no illusions that unfortunately we are now in a battle. We're in a battle with the right who sense an opportunity from a Scottish government that's lacking in strategy and energy, and they're making a push on the very principle of universal benefits and the very foundation of the welfare state. The rollback on free school meals, the betrayal as it was described by the STUC on free school meals, is only a starting point and an indication, unfortunately, of where the direction of travel is at the moment. And if we're not careful, the right will continue to push on that open door, and prescriptions, the limited rollout of free public transport to those under 22, to asylum seekers it's already went, and to those senior citizens will also be under attack. Free tuition will be under attack, free personal care. The very policies that, I think for me and for everybody else in this room, was the clearest indication are where the benefits of devolution and using the powers of the Parliament to chart a different course here in Scotland compared to Westminster. All of them will be under attack unless we get ourselves together, get ourselves organised and lead the campaign against that. And that appears to be with this current incumbent SNP government, and most certainly will be continued after 2026 by any formation, a unionist government, probably led by Anna Sarwar. And lastly, just touching on the domestic situation and where we are now, the announcement just a couple of days ago about Grangemouth, I think it should be loud and clear for this conference today that the 400 direct jobs, the thousands indirect jobs that will be affected by that closure, we cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow the oil and gas workers We cannot allow the oil and gas workers of today to be the miners of yesterday and the resulting impact that will have on those communities. And so the second question that I think we should address is, how did we get here? And in many ways, actually, we've probably all got a semblance of responsibility to take here. And I hate to lay the blame at one person's door, but the inescapable truth and reality is that the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon and those around her, although electorally successful for the SNP, was pretty disastrous for the rest of the movement as a whole. As successful as it was operating in a culture of deference, a culture of unquestioning loyalty, a question of ultimate control freakery, politics by press release and by soundbite, and that's not to mention, of course, the matters that are currently under live police investigation. So if you look at the policy programme, as I touched on earlier, the Supreme Court misstep, the collapsing of the movement in 2016 inside the People's Vote campaign, the conscious and deliberate tying tightly of the independence movement with the question of Europe, regardless of the inevitable consequences that then brings, with deficits, budgets, the need for a central bank, our trade with the rest of the UK, or the simple fact that 30% of yes voters in 2014 then voted leave in 2016. And for the benefit of doubt, I wasn't one of them. I voted Remain, but I did so as a lesser of two evils. And with no illusions in the EU as an institution and as a project. Over the last 10 years, we've took our greatest strength, which was a diversity of thought, but a unity in purpose, and we turned it into a party political devotion, with all that such a move entails. And I'm going to mention a date in 2014 that probably doesn't come to the memory as easy as the 18th of September, and that's the 22nd of November. Now, on that day, myself, Kat, Jerry, and probably others were all in the armadillo. And looking back on it, it's probably quite a clear indication of the direction of travel. Because in that same day, the SNP decided to book the Hydro and have what was essentially a political rock event with Nicola Sturgeon as the main event. A deliberate and quite visual stamping on the wider independence movement to say that no, post-2014, we're in charge and we'll dictate the nature of this campaign and the direction that it travels. And lastly, where do we go now? I hope that today's event is the sort that can hopefully begin to chart us on a path where the independence movement once again looks, feels and sounds much more like the insurgent force that existed in 2014, and I believe it did genuinely exist, rather than the governing class that it's looked like, particularly since post-2017. Now that means, for me, actually reasserting the fundamentals about what independence actually means. And independence to me means real change. We are a disruptive force. We shouldn't run away from that, we should lean into that. Because when the force that you're trying to disrupt is the British state, scarred by the two twin evils of poverty and inequality, then I'm quite happy to lean into that. It means that at Holyrood level, it means governing competently, imaginatively, with drive and purpose, albeit within the limitations of devolution, but using that to expand the confidence and life chances of working class people in their parliament and their politics. It means creating a separate and distinct campaign for independence, outside of the structures and direct control with the SNP leadership, and one that truly reflects the breadth of our movement. It means again putting foreign policy at the heart of the case for an independent Scotland, a Scotland that wants to play a peaceful and constructive role in the world. No an independence movement that sees the SNP youth wing meet with no the saltire behind them, no even the Catalan flag behind them, no the Basque flag behind them, but the NATO flag. And it means saying clearly and loudly here today that you cannot claim to be a progressive at home while supporting a genocide abroad. We need a programme that's rooted in the concerns and aspirations of working class people, Scotland's working class majority, that will be key and crucial to winning independence. Maybe then, and only then, can we begin to imagine the radicalism, the hope and the momentum of 2014 all over again. And I'll finish with delivering a quote from somebody much wiser and more experienced in these matters than me, that there are decades where nothing happens and that there are weeks where decades happen. Let's make sure collectively that the next decade doesn't become one of those. Thanks very much.
Well, stirring stuff. We didn't necessarily agree with every word, but definitely food for thought. So now back to the studio with Liam.
I hope that those in attendance found it useful. If your listeners want to read at least some of it, then a kind of text version of it was published in the National. I've always been in the kind of pessimistic end of where we are, and have been for quite some time. We've had discussions even within the SSP on this, and I think I've always been at the more sort of pessimistic end about the prospects and the kind of short to medium term for independence. But in terms of how we move forward, I think we need to get back to basics and fundamentals in some ways about, well, what actually is independence? What does it mean? For me, I think we should embrace the fact that the independence movement is a disruptive force. We do want to disrupt the status quo because the status quo doesn't work for so many of us. And I feel as if the movement's moved away from that. And we've lost the energy and the momentum and the drive that existed in 2014 and in the immediate aftermath of 2014. And it was that sort of wave that propelled the the SNP in 2015 in the campaign when they won 56 seats. So I think we need to get back to some fundamentals about, well, what is the independence movement? Who are we trying to appeal to? And what kind of message and how are we campaigning?
That's really, really interesting. And I completely agree. And I think in a way it's the sort of the curse of being in power is what's almost sidetracked I'm going to say used a lot of energy from the SNP because they're in government. But I just cannot get excited and enthused and motivated about somebody doing Westminster's agenda efficiently. I want them to stand up and fight, I want us to get together and say, no, we're not having this, and get everybody riled up behind them and make a stand. And I just don't see any sign of that happening. And I think that sort of that disruptive force that you're describing, that is in a way, it's a luxury when you're the underdog or you're the opposition. You've got the freedom to do that. It's much harder when you're also trying to keep the wheels spinning on everything else. But that is something really important that I do think we've lost.
Yeah, and that point you make, Fiona, is actually really kind of key to it, because the single biggest strategic mistake, I think, post 2014 was the Yes movement almost unilaterally enveloping itself inside the SNP. Because when you turn a movement like the independence movement, and it's hard to look back on it and reflect and describe to people who weren't there, it was a genuine mass movement that wasn't connected to any single political party. And when we moved into that space post-referendum, we tied the independence movement to the fortunes of the SNP. And when the polls were riding high for the SNP, then perhaps that maybe benefited the movement in the short term, but inevitably, politically, there was always going to be another side to that hill. And us tying the independence case so fundamentally with the SNP as a party political project, I think was the kind of single biggest mistake that the movement made post 2014, and many of the problems that we face now, unfortunately, are as a result of that.
There's always pros and cons, isn't there, to that? Because, as you said, I mean, there are definite cons to that having happened. On the other hand, there are definite benefits from it having happened, because we've had an SNP or an independence supporting government in Scotland for a while, and what gets me, and I think they've done a lot of good stuff. There's a whole raft of policies that have been brought about, and they're very much the kind of policies that, from a UK point of view, you'd think, oh, well, that's the kind of thing a Labour government you'd want to do. And they've been put in place up here. Mistakes have been made, and things could have happened that haven't been done. But quite a lot of things. But at the same time, somehow, I don't know. I think the SNP sort of could be better at blowing their own trumpet in a kind of way, and admitting that there's a big question about why we no further forward from the point of view of independence support, but at least taking on board what they have done. And I think myself, they've got 2 years before the next Holyrood election. I just want them to do a couple of big things that would, get people behind them. And, it's not hard to think of what example. I mean, the obvious one would be something more about land reform, because, anyone who knows that half of Scotland's, or more than half's, owned by 500 people, none of us want that. Or maybe something about, to kind of devolve more powers down to local authorities, something a bit more radical that would, garner support behind them. And I'm not getting any signals from the current SNP government that really they're even thinking about that. And I just think that's such a shame. And, well, we'll see what happens in 2016. Maybe by that time the Labour bubble will have burst a bit, and people who voted for them will have come back and voted for independent support. And
I think, or worse, they'll just stay at home, because you've got to have something to actually turn up for. And there was something in, I think it was the Greens, I forget which one of them. Obviously, budget discussions are coming up. Their suggestion was, what about a massive tax on private jets? No, yes, if there's ever a group of people who've got money to burn and it's, doing harm to the environment, it's taking resources that we could then use in, public services, green transport, whatever. I would be completely behind that, and I'll be really annoyed if they don't do it just because they're annoyed with the Greens. It's just that level of sort of pettiness that is quite dispiriting.
Exactly. If you were sitting in Holyrood, Liam, if you were an MSP in Holyrood, what would you want to take forward?
I certainly wouldn't be taking the level of freebies it seems to be.
On
the cards in Westminster, and I would imagine that probably extends north of the border as well, and there's maybe a story or two to be investigated there for any investigative journalists that happen to be tuning in. But speaking kind of more seriously on a policy front, I mean, you mentioned land reform there. I mean, the obvious one that jumps out at me is council tax. The SNP were elected in 2007 on a pledge to scrap what they called then the unfair council tax. It's now 2024. It's no any more fair in 2024 than it was in 2007. And actually, a huge part of the budget process has been the systematic attacks on local government funding. And it's led to a situation where, I mean, I'm here in Glasgow. I don't know what it's like in your local authorities, but I mean, Glasgow City Council now are in a state that even the most basic of services you would have thought, even 10 years ago during the time of the referendum, the city's struggling to provide. And it's noticeable in many ways actually in Glasgow City Centre, the decline, and the workers at the sharp end of that are having to do more, often for less. And are continually year on year having to go into pay battles, and in some cases, in the likes of the cleansing workers, actually go out on strike just to maintain a fair pay rate. So the obvious one that jumps out at me would be to scrap the council tax and replace it with what the SSP campaign for would be a Scottish service tax, which is, I don't know if you've had other representatives of the party discussing this before, but essentially, it would be replacing the council tax with an income-based alternative so that it's redistributive. And as I say, those who earn the most pay the most. And I've actually got some figures here that I could provide if I can.
Well, we did actually cover the SSP manifesto in one of our shows before the general election, because actually it was the best laid out of the ones that we'd come across, and it was really detailed. So, by all means, give us some figures. And the other thing I was going to say, I mentioned this other event we'd been to. Leslie Riddick was giving an example of in Sweden, only higher rate taxpayers pay tax to central government. Everybody else pays it to their local authority because that's where they're getting their services from. And it's resulted in a 90% voting because they've got your money.
In terms of local government in Scotland, I mean, I think as well as the funding, you're right, there is a case to be made for further devolution of powers.
Yeah, and much smaller councils as well, more local is what the thrust of that sort of.
Yeah, because local democracy in Scotland, unfortunately, isn't very local.
No.
No. So I've got some of the figures here on the.
Oh yeah, go on then.
Our proposal would be that any income earned up to £12,000 would be service tax free. Income between that and £15,000 would be charged at a rate of £135 a year. Income up to £20,000, £360 a year. Income up to £30,000 would be £810 a year. And an MP, now this is slightly outdated because they've since had a pay rise, but an MP who was on £87,000 a year would pay £8,870 per year in service tax. So you can see the clear model that we're following there. Yeah, and on those figures, it would mean about 75% of households pay less than they do currently, but it would double the funds that local government have currently got to operate within. It would take funds from roughly 2 billion to just over 4 billion.
Wow.
The thing with that system as well, it avoids this problem, which, I mean, where I live, there's a lot of older single people in what have been large family homes. So you've got this one person on their pension. Their home is worth masses, but it's not money that's available to them because it's tied up in the house. And at the moment, they are hit for massive amounts of council tax because of potential value of their house, but actually bears no relation to what their income is or how much of the services they're actually using. It's
the value of the house itself probably isn't accurate or up to date either, because I think on last check, the last time that they did any sort of kind of valuation checks on property in relation to council tax was in the 1990s.
Am I got that right? And that would be, council taxes for a property, for a house. So, we pay council tax here and it's based on just us on the property, but it would be per person. So every kind of adult would be liable, or, maybe wouldn't be paying much, but they'd be liable for that council tax. Because is that not a bit like the poll tax? If I'm right, is that not a bit like the poll tax?
Well, it's based on your income, so it's based on your ability to pay rather than the flat rate.
Yeah, but it is per head. It is each person.
It would be per work. Yeah, it would be per work.
And the other thing as well with that you can't capture is the likes of what a land tax would. People with massive sporting estates, for example, their income, and if they've got a decent accountant, their income is probably not great, because a lot of them are still getting small business bonuses and relief and things because of the way their tax affairs are arranged. So if it's on their income, it might be that they're not paying very much, and yet the amount of land they own is hugely valuable. And that's kind of where the land tax thing would be.
Then you could argue, well, maybe that would be where it would even out. Because if you could bring in that arrangement, instead of the council tax at the moment, say we did that, and a land tax, that would kind of be the best of both worlds, wouldn't it? Or best of lots of worlds. Because people who own a lot of land would also have to be paying, for that. They don't at the moment. But also, like some of your neighbours, I don't know if they're your near neighbours, but some of the people in your locale with the big houses would be something that they'd have to pay just because it was a bigger, posher house, and maybe that would help folk to.
It's about opening the door, I suppose, on this conversation, and it probably comes back to what you were saying there in terms of the current government. I mean, in many ways, it looks as if they've almost accepted their fate for 2026.
I got that impression as well. And in fact, somebody at the conference we were at last weekend, Marlene, said that they were like rabbits in the headlights. They kind of said they're paralyzed. They're not going to actually do anything because they're afraid of the onslaught when they do try and do something, which is kind of understandable, but it's not what you want in a government.
No, it's not what you want in a government. And I mean, to be fair, I mean, there's all this kind of, restrictions now and cutting, and like local authorities don't have so much budgets. But, behind that is that the amount of money that ScotGov is getting from the UK Treasury has gone down, by a large amount. So, just to be fair to kind of say that, it's not just because they're putting the squeeze on local authorities and, actually they don't have the money just isn't coming through. But it's just a bit disappointing. I mean, you can understand if you've been in power for 17 years and people get wearied, and there must be a lot of energy just goes in keeping things chugging along. So to have, it's great for the three of us. We could sit here and go, I don't do that, and they could do that, and look, that would help. Which it might be true what we're saying. It's probably more complicated than maybe we might imagine.
Imagine it is.
But if you can imagine it, if we can imagine it, well, why can't they imagine it and at least talk a bit about it? That would give us, the rest of us, a bit of a boost. Anyway, tell us what you did in 2014.
So in 2014, I would have been 18. So at the time of the referendum, I turned 18 in the March, and most of my last year at high school, my study periods were spent essentially independence campaigning.
Well done.
If any of my past teachers are watching this, then I apologise. But no, I mean, looking back on that kind of time for me, it's strange thinking back now, because that level of activism, I mean, in many ways I was lucky. I mean, that was the first major political campaign I was involved in. It just so happened to be that it had taken other people decades of campaigning to get us to that point. So I realise how, I realise how lucky and how fortunate I was at that time. So I joined the SSP in 2014, involved in the SSP's campaigning, We were the kind of socialist wing of the Yes movement, as I'm sure you're aware. We had Colin Fox on the Yes Scotland Advisory Board, and we had input into the official Yes campaign, and we also had a strong presence in the Radical Independence campaign, and that's where most of my energy was spent at that time. So I was the joint organiser of the Glasgow North and East branch, as it was then, of the Radical Independence campaign, and it was myself and a few others, including folk from both within and outside the SSP, that kind of gave birth to the idea of the mass canvass events that became sort of synonymous with Radical Independence towards the end of the campaign. And in fact, the very first one happened more or less where I am now, in Easterhouse. So, which is still where I live now. So, and I was also, just because of my age, was involved in a lot of the sort of youth work. So the Generation Yes stuff, as it was then, and a lot of the kind of schools kind of work that was done, and even something just as simple as wearing a Yes lapel on a school blazer at that time would be enough to initiate a conversation. And there was genuine conversations happening at that time. Although I made this joke at the conference as well. I mean, that's just passed there. 10 years later, I'm still clinging on to that youth campaigner.
Well, from our point of view, you definitely still are.
Yeah, totally. We don't think we're that far off being youth campaigners. Well, something you said there, though, about it was all conversations, and it strikes me as astonishing just how different, how polarized things are now. And it's very difficult to have a conversation without it being emotional. And I had a little Twitter exchange just a couple of days ago with Adam Tompkins, funnily enough, because he'd tweeted going, all this talk about it being joyous and civic in 2014, it wasn't, it was toxic. And I replied and I said, well, that wasn't my experience, and I wasn't campaigning then. I was just an ordinary person. And me and my ordinary person friends just had conversations all the time. We all had different views. We found out more information and we chatted. And then somebody else replied to that going, nuts, blah, blah, blah. Well, it wasn't what it was like. They were horrible. And I just replied and I said, well, maybe I've got nicer friends than you did, because that just absolutely wasn't that toxic thing. But it is difficult now because everybody's already got an opinion. But see, the ones who were not old enough to vote in 2014, that whole group, we've got 10 years worth of people who we don't really know what their opinions are. We don't know how they discuss things amongst themselves. Have you got any, being a lot closer to that group than we are, have you got any sort of insight?
I think they would naturally be towards being a supporter of independence without kind of generalising too much. Although in the absence of a campaign and in the absence of the issue being front and centre, I suppose, and the way it was then, I don't know what level or to what extent those conversations are happening. So without wanting to kind of generalise too much, I would say I would imagine that most of that sort of age cohort would be certainly open to having the conversation about supporting independence. But I mean, like you said, Fiona, I mean, that certainly wasn't my experience of 2014 either. And part of the thinking behind the mass canvass and the period before that was the voter registration drive. It was consciously done in working class areas that traditionally had almost sort of a left politics. And to many, I suppose, who had been involved in politics, they did see that as a problem and as a threat, because politics, as far as they could see it, was a closed shop. And we were determined to make sure that actually, no, we were going to open the doors again and bring in a huge swathe of people who, as I say, otherwise had totally switched off from politics. So the same areas that we did the voter registration drives were then the same areas that we went back into with the mass canvass to actually discuss politics. And the voter registration drives, I mean, I had never thought I would see anything like it in places like here in Easterhouse, where outside the shopping centre or the job centre, you would have queues of people lining up to register to vote at the time.
Yeah. I live near Alloa, and the stories of Rick just going in the tenements and coming back with, 100% of people registering to vote are kind of still talked about now. But what a force that organisation was. And yet, where is it now?
Yeah, even when you think back as well, I mean, if you think about the public meetings that were happening, I mean, from an SSP point of view, we were putting public meetings on almost every single night of the week across the country, and the attendances at them were phenomenal. I mean, I'm thinking back to one in Ayr. It had filled the town hall with Jim Sillars and Colin Fox speaking on the case for an independent socialist Scotland. And that was the kind of headline banner that we used in public meetings right across the country. And as I say, the level of engagement and the turnouts that we were getting at those public meetings were like turnouts that you would, unfortunately, we haven't been able to maintain since. Looking back on it, you actually pause for reflection a bit and think what was actually happening in the country at large at that time.
Yeah. It's interesting that, isn't it? I mean, that's just reminded me about, you definitely won't remember this, but when the Shirley Williams and co left the Labour Party and set up the SDP, and there was this big kind of response, and they stood for Parliament in by-elections, and were being kind of voted in with kind of massive majorities. And at one point, Shirley Williams was up in Glasgow City Halls, and the Glasgow City Halls was packed. It was absolutely packed with folk just wanting to know what they thought and why had they done this, because it was it's a big move to move away from the party that's got the likelihood to be in power and say, no, it's not working, we want to do it differently. And it was a bit like that in 2014 as well, wasn't it? I find it quite moving to sort of think, that campaign to get people onto the voters list, when people hadn't bothered, well, presumably they hadn't bothered because they didn't think it, about them. So, they didn't bother kind of. And then you go in and you say, no, do it, because then you've got a voice. And maybe this is a bit more too simplistic, but if politicians know there's a certain part of the, demographics that don't vote, well, they're not going to bother that much about what that particular bunch of folk are needing too much. They'll go for the ones that they know will vote. So, I find it really moving to think, God, all those folk were kind of brought in, and I mean, I'm sure some of them haven't carried on voting, but a lot of them I will have. And that means, they've been paid attention to. Hopefully all of that hasn't been lost, because that was so valuable. It's just fantastic.
I definitely think there's a generation of people who, had the referendum not happened, kind of campaigning that we are speaking about now didn't happen, then they probably wouldn't have been engaged in the political process at any point. And it becomes that sort of chicken and egg where politicians don't pay attention to those areas because those areas don't vote. Those areas don't vote because they feel politicians don't pay attention to that area. And you then have that tenuous, almost kind of death cycle where that level of political engagement just doesn't happen. And it's not because people in areas like here or areas like it don't have the same levels of aspiration or engagement as other areas. It's just that, as I say, you end up on that kind of cycle, and it's really difficult to break that. But much of the backbone of the 2015 SNP almost wipeout in the Labour Party in Scotland was built during the referendum campaign. It wasn't built in the 6 weeks building up to the 2015 election.
So what do you think has caused the about turn then in the current fortunes? Because you've got a Labour Party in Westminster and one in Scotland, both headed by millionaires. It's not exactly your working class hero. But how did they manage to get that result that they got in the general election in Scotland?
I think it was as much a disenfranchisement from the SNP as what it was a kind of rip-roaring, let's get behind Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And to be honest, I think that's the case right across the whole UK. I mean, this is a majority that is built on sand in many ways. It's large in scale in parliamentary terms. But let's not forget, Keir Starmer got less percentage and votes than Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017 and 19. Scotland specifically, I think a lot of it was to send a message to the SNP and to the independence movement, I suppose, more broadly, but particularly to the SNP, that what people had seen for, in particular, I think the last few years under the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon, I must say, certainly towards the latter end of that leadership, was a politics and priorities that wasn't reflecting what they were experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So I think it was as much that as it was a outward reach to the Labour Party. And if the Labour Party in Scotland think that we're once again back to pre-referendum politics, where they can almost take the votes of people in Glasgow or the Central Belt for granted, then I think they're very much mistaken, and they might well find that out in about 18 months.
Yeah.
So a poll, or a reference to a poll, that Star Wars popularity is plummeting, and he's only just now more popular than Douglas Ross. Now Douglas Ross is only just more popular than bubonic plague, so they're really not a great start.
Is that just within the Scottish Tories, you mean, or is that the population at large?
Yeah, they've gone from in Scotland from having one MP to having however many they've got. I've forgotten.
37.
And some of those MPs, they're there with something like 15,000 votes. Now that's not 15,000 majority, but just 15,000 or thereabouts votes. I mean, I know there's a spread about it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that is built on sand, because that could be knocked back. I must say that we've now got a Labour MP. I'm in Glasgow North, and I wrote her a very long and detailed email about winter fuel payments and pension credits. And I used to be a citizens advice advisor, Liam. So, I kind of know the numbers of folk could go in there, elderly people, like even more elderly than me. And we always said to them, have you applied for pension credit? And the number of folk who didn't even know about it. Anyway, I sent this long and detailed email. I haven't even had an acknowledgement for it. She's now got the chair. She's the chairperson of the Scottish Affairs Committee at Westminster. So she's not without a bit of influence.
The Labour Party already. I mean, if they had any pretence of a honeymoon, that certainly didn't last very long. The two biggest policy announcements that they're now associated with in their time in office so far has been the retention of the two-child benefit cap and all that entails at one end of the age scale, condemning hundreds of thousands of kids to poverty. By choice, a political choice was made to retain the two-child benefit cap. And I'll touch on a kind of small anecdote during the general election campaign in a minute. And then at the other end of the age scale, as you were saying there, the attacks on the winter fuel payments. And the idea that only affects well-off pensioners, as you've rightly said there, Marlene, is a complete nonsense.
You've got Starmer having his wife's clothes given to her in the thousands of pounds worth. He's getting free tickets for the football. It's just amazing.
Is it any wonder when people see that kind of thing that they think, I'm sick of a lot of them? You can understand where that feeling comes from. But during the general election, obviously I was the SSP candidate in Glasgow East, and the Glasgow East went from SNP to Labour. And we had a hustings event organised by a food bank. And the questions, as you can imagine, at a food bank related hustings were all focused on poverty and how to combat poverty and what kind of anti-poverty measures the incoming Labour government would bring in, because at that point it was clear to everybody and there was no point pretending otherwise. I think even the local Tory candidate accepted as much, that Labour were going to form the next government. And what struck me there was nothing coming forward. There was nothing. It was this magical economic growth that they keep talking about. The economic growth and growing the economy was going to solve the levels of poverty that we have just now. And it would be, it might not be immediate. You might need to wait 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah.
People at the sharp end of poverty can't afford to wait 3, 4 and 5 years, because for some of them it is as sharp as they might not be here in 3, 4
They might not get
years.
through this winter.
Exactly.
But I mean, that's the other thing with growth as well and investment. It's where is the money going? A lot of this investment is so somebody else can get rich. We don't necessarily see it. A couple of other questions I just wanted to make sure we asked you. Reform UK. Were you surprised at how well they did? What do you think's behind that?
Slightly surprised, but not greatly. I think, unfortunately, and I wish that this wasn't the case, but we don't have a Scottish exceptionalism to racism, unfortunately. And I think for too many people, they assume that Scotland's as a whole is a really progressive, outward-looking, forward-thinking country, and that we don't the racism problems that you see elsewhere don't apply here. And frankly, that's just not the case. So there's an element of the Reform vote that is that. Certainly in Glasgow and the West Coast as well, there's an element of the Reform vote that would voted Tory over the last 5 years in Glasgow, certainly in Glasgow and in other parts of the west of Scotland, will be connected in some way, shape or form to the Orange Order in many parts. And there's also a section of the Reform vote who will be that person who I was just referencing a minute ago that says they're all the same.
Yeah.
There would be traditional Labour voters who don't see anything in Starmer or Sarwar that would make them vote Labour. They won't vote Tory. Managed to tap into a message and a mood, a kind of anti-politics mood that I think it's the responsibility of people like me and people on the left of politics to offer the socialist alternative to that.
Yeah. So that actually brings me to the second question I was going to ask, which is, we've got 2 years to go, or 18 months to go until the next Holyrood election. What are an SSP going to be doing to try and get yourself in there? Because my ideal parliament is the genuine rainbow parliament with representation from as many of our parties as we can. And SSP were represented. Yeah. You know, 6 at one point, I think, the year that Colin Fox was in. And you guys, to be fair, you turn up everywhere. You always see SSP flags. You've always got a stall. But what is it you're going to do to try and get yourself into the running for Holyrood? Or is that your intention?
It would certainly be the intention in 2026 to return SSP representation to the Parliament. To be honest, I think, I suppose you would say I would say this, but I think it would be good for the Parliament.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think even the SSP's biggest detractors would say that when we had SSP MSPs, they were very hard working and that they pursued the policy agenda in which they were elected, whether that be. And actually, we probably punched above our weight when you think about free prescriptions, free school meals, free transport. Many of these policies have been enacted since by the SNP or by the SNP Green government, or a kind of small version of it when it comes to transport. So in terms of setting the agenda, we probably punched above our weight. So no, that would certainly be the intention. Now, how you do that, it's always difficult because we're also in that sort of chicken and egg scenario where, because we're not in the Parliament, we don't get the same media coverage that others do. Yeah. But in order to get in the Parliament, you need to have a degree of national media presence. So it is difficult. And if you look at left-wing socialist parties across Europe, not just here in Britain, then it is a tall ask. But that would certainly be the intention.
You've been speaking at a conference there. We've been to 2 conferences in the last fortnight. There's another several coming up in October and November, and it may be that that is where we're shifting towards in the independence movement. And we were mulling over where the conversation has shifted from should we be independent to okay, how are we going to do it when we are independent, which is a much more practical. It's a development from the theoretical sort of end of it, and a whole load of conferences, whether it's constitutional conventions, citizens conventions, citizens assemblies, whatever name they're by, those are all platforms. So I suppose that's the opportunity to get involved and to start reaching out to people. Because we looked at all the manifestos when we were doing our election specials, and there was nothing on the SSP one that we disagreed with. It was just a really, really good set of ideas.
Surely to goodness we can get someone from the SSP elected, at least from Glasgow, from the Glasgow list. That would be great, actually.
That'd be really good.
That would be great.
I would certainly like to hope so, Marlene. And during the general election, UK general elections are always the most difficult terrain for a party like the SSP because, as you just said there, Fiona, we get that a lot. That I agree with everything you're saying, but I'm going to vote SNP or I'm going to vote Labour because it's only the SNP or Labour that can win. But the Scottish Parliament election, as you've said there, Marlene, that offers you the opportunity through the list vote to vote for a party and a politics that reflects your views and your beliefs more strongly. So I would urge, as I'm sure you can imagine, everybody who's a socialist in Glasgow to put their cross when the time comes next to the SSP.
Absolutely. So listen, It's been really good chatting to you, Liam. Really pleased that we managed to kind of get this to happen after it was quite a long time. Fiona and I said we should get Liam on, and so it's really good. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me on. As I say, I know you've had a couple of representatives for the party on in the past, and any time you guys approach the SSP, then we'll always be more than happy to engage. So hopefully your listeners enjoyed that, and I'll send you the link to the national piece.
That'd be great.
People can read a bit more.
Oh, we thoroughly enjoyed our conversation with Liam there. Thanks again, Liam, for joining us. And thanks to everybody for listening. If you're interested in the Conter conference that we mentioned a few times, the one that Liam spoke at, we do have an episode coming up in probably a couple of weeks' time, which is the highlights from some of the speeches and me and Marlene discussing what we thought of some of the ideas. It's well worth a listen. But in the meantime, we will be back next week as usual, and we'll catch you all later. Thanks for listening. Bye now.